After the storm comes the hardest choice: move on, or risk losing everything again. It had been months since I first sensed something was wrong with Alyssa. At first, I told myself it was work, late meetings, client dinners, overtime. But when the late nights turned into whole weekends, and she started wearing clothes I hadn't seen her in before, let alone for me, I knew something was off. It was Nathan, her colleague. I didn't need to see them together to know. The look she gave her phone when his messages came in, the way she smiled at the screen like a teenager with a crush, it was all so obvious, so insulting. But I didn't confront her. I couldn't. Not at first. Instead, I buried myself in work and focused on our two kids, Dylan and Emma. Dylan had just turned 15, the age where every look he gave me was a challenge. Every word from me was met with rolled eyes. Emma was different. She'd always been quiet, the kind of kid who found her peace in books and drawing. But lately, she'd been withdrawing even more, retreating to her room after dinner without so much as a word. We were falling apart, all of us, but no one wanted to say it out loud. One evening, Alyssa came home late again. She walked through the door, keys jangling in her hand, her smile too bright, too fake. "Sorry I'm late," she said, not even looking at me. Work was crazy. Work. Always work. I didn't say anything. I just watched her head into the kitchen to grab something to eat. The kids were already upstairs, and I was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV. I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. My mind raced every night, wondering how I had let it get this bad. How had I let her slip away so easily? Dinner was the only time we were together as a family anymore, and even that was falling apart. The silence at the table was louder than anything we could say. Dylan would finish eating in record time, tossing his fork onto his plate before disappearing into the night with his friends. Emma would quietly follow, her eyes on her plate, never making a sound. Alyssa and I were the last to finish, and even then, neither of us spoke. We just existed, side by side like strangers. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I remember it clearly because it was the first time in months that Alyssa had looked at me like I was still her husband. "I'm not going to put up with the kids' attitudes much longer, Ryan," she said, her voice sharp as she wiped down the kitchen counter. "If you don't do something, I will." I felt my stomach knot. "I'll handle it," I replied, though I had been saying that for weeks. The truth was, I didn't know how to handle anything anymore. Alyssa slammed the rag down onto the counter. "You've been saying that for weeks. What's gotten into them? Why are they acting like spoiled brats all of a sudden?" I stared at her, at the audacity of it all. "You really don't know?" I asked, my voice calm, though inside, everything was raging. "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped. I took a deep breath, feeling the words rise to the surface. "I'm moving out, Alyssa. Tomorrow." She froze. The plate she had been holding clattered back onto the counter with a sharp thud. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was shaky now, uncertainty creeping in. "I'm taking the kids. We're leaving tomorrow." Her expression hardened. "There's no way in hell you're taking my kids out of this house. What makes you think you can do something that stupid?" I locked eyes with her, the silence between us crackling like electricity. "They're the ones who decided," I said quietly. She stood there, stunned, and I could see the realization dawn on her face. The kids knew. They had known all along. And now I was taking them away. She didn't speak after that. She just turned her back on me, muttering under her breath as she cleared the table. But I was done. Done with pretending. Done with waiting for her to come to her senses. That night, after she went to bed, I packed my things. The kids had already done the same. Dylan's beat-up duffel bag was stuffed full, and Emma's little suitcase sat quietly by the front door. They were ready, even if I wasn't. As I loaded the last bag into the car, I sent a message to my sister, Megan, in Portland. "We're coming. Be there by morning." By the time Alyssa realized what was happening, it would be too late. Dylan drove his old Honda Civic, Emma riding shotgun, while I followed behind in my SUV, loaded down with whatever we could grab in one night. The kids hadn't said much, just quiet nods and short replies as we packed. Maybe they were in shock, maybe they were relieved. Either way, we were on the road to Portland by sunrise. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me in Seattle. We made it to my sister Megan's house by mid-morning. She greeted us at the door with open arms and that no-nonsense attitude I'd always relied on. Megan was the glue in our family, the one who never let anyone fall apart without swooping in to fix it. She didn't ask too many questions, just hugged Dylan and Emma, then dragged me into the kitchen. "You want to tell me what the hell happened?" she asked, handing me a cup of coffee, as if it were the most natural thing in the world that I'd suddenly show up on her doorstep with my 2 kids and no explanation. "It's over," I said simply. "Alyssa's been cheating." Megan's face tightened, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded, like that explained everything. And in a way it did. For the first few days, we fell into a strange kind of routine. The kids started at their new schools, while I spent my time helping Megan around the house and applying for remote work. Alyssa tried calling once, twice, but I ignored her. I wasn't ready to deal with her excuses, her apologies that would probably come too late. It wasn't long before Sarah came into the picture. Megan had mentioned her casually, as if Sarah was just another old friend who happened to still be in town. What she didn't say was that Sarah had been the girl I was crazy about in high school, the one I'd almost married if life hadn't gotten in the way. I wasn't expecting to run into her at the coffee shop a few blocks from Megan's house. She looked almost exactly the same smile, same wild hair. It was like being thrown back in time. "Ryan?" Her voice cut through the noise of the cafe like a knife. I turned, startled, and there she was, standing just a few feet away, holding a to-go cup and looking at me like she couldn't quite believe it. "Sarah." We sat down awkward at first, but the conversation flowed easily after that. She told me about her time abroad, how she'd been working as an artist in Europe for the past decade, and how she'd only recently moved back to Portland to be closer to her family. "And you?" she asked, leaning forward. "What brings you back here?" I hesitated, wondering how much to share. But before I could decide, the words were already spilling out. "My marriage fell apart. We moved here to start fresh." Sarah's eyes softened with understanding, but she didn't push for more. Instead, she smiled. "Well, maybe Portland's what you need." I wasn't sure if Portland was what I needed, but I knew I didn't want to stop talking to Sarah. We met again the next week and the week after that. Before I knew it, I was looking forward to those afternoons with her, more than I should have been. But things at home weren't getting any easier. Dylan had started hanging out with a rougher crowd at school. His grades were slipping, and more than once I caught him sneaking out after curfew. Emma was quieter than ever, shutting me out completely. I was losing them both, and I had no idea how to fix it. Then Alyssa showed up. She'd driven all the way from Seattle, unannounced, desperate to see the kids. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, looking disheveled and frantic, I knew this wasn't going to go well. "I just want to talk," she pleaded, her voice raw. "To you, to Dylan, to Emma, please." I wanted to slam the door in her face, but Dylan had already seen her from the living room. "What the hell is she doing here?" he snapped, storming past me before I could stop him. "Dylan," Alyssa started, but he cut her off. "You think you can just show up and everything will be fine? You ruined everything, Mom." The words hit her like a punch, and for a second I thought she was going to break down right there. But Alyssa wasn't the kind of woman to crumble. She stood taller, her eyes pleading with me now. "Ryan, we need to talk." "No, we don't," I said, my voice cold. "You need to leave." For a long moment, she didn't move, and I could see her weighing her options. But she must have realized she wasn't going to get anywhere with Dylan or me, because she finally turned, walking back to her car without another word. That night, as I sat on the back porch, staring into the dark, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. I was just done. Done with the lies, the pain, the guilt. Done with Alyssa. And maybe, just maybe, ready for something new. A few days after Alyssa's visit, things started to shift. Dylan was quieter, more withdrawn. but he hadn't run off in the middle of the night again. Emma, while still reserved, started drawing more, her sketchpad always tucked under her arm. I didn't push either of them. They were dealing with things in their own way, and honestly, so was I. Sarah and I kept meeting up. At first, it felt like we were just picking up where we'd left off in high school, but there was something more to it now. Our conversations moved beyond small talk. Late afternoons stretched into evenings, and soon, I found myself confiding in her like I hadn't with anyone in years. "So," she said one night after we'd grabbed dinner at this little taco place downtown, "what's the next step?" I leaned back, the question catching me off guard. "Next step? In what?" "In your life, Ryan. You've uprooted everything, moved here with the kids, but what's next?" I stared at my plate, unsure how to answer. "Honestly, I don't know. I thought I'd figure it out when we got here, but now I feel like I'm just floating." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That makes sense. You've been in survival mode. Maybe now it's time to think about what you actually want." Her words stuck with me. I had been so focused on making sure the kids were okay, on dealing with Alyssa's betrayal, that I hadn't stopped to think about what I actually wanted. Did I even know? The answer came a few days later. Dylan came home from school, his face flushed with excitement. "Dad, I need to talk to you." My heart sank a little. Every conversation with him lately felt like a new problem to solve. "What's up, bud?" "There's this soccer league in Portland. It's legit, like really competitive. Some of the guys at school are on it, and the coach said I could try out." The relief that washed over me was immediate. This wasn't another crisis. This was hope. "When are tryouts?" "Next Saturday." "But it's a big commitment, Dad." "Practices, games, it's gonna be a lot." I smiled for the first time in what felt like days. "I think we can handle that." The excitement in his eyes was the first sign of life I'd seen in Dylan for weeks. Maybe this move hadn't broken him after all. Emma, on the other hand, was still a puzzle. She spent hours in her room, drawing, or sitting in the backyard with her sketchpad. One afternoon, I sat down beside her on the porch. "Hey, Em." She didn't look up from her drawing, but I saw her shoulders tense slightly. "Hey, Dad." I glanced over at the page. It was a detailed sketch of a tree, its branches twisting in intricate patterns. "That's really good." "Thanks," she muttered, still not meeting my gaze. "Is there anything you want to talk about? Anything on your mind?" For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer, but then she set her pencil down and finally looked at me. "Why didn't you tell us sooner? About Mom and everything?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been waiting for this, dreading it. "I didn't know how," I said softly. "I didn't want to hurt you." Emma sighed, a deep, heavy sound for a 12-year-old. "We already knew." I nodded, my throat tight. "I know. I'm sorry, Emma. I should have told you. I wasn't ready." She didn't say anything else, just picked up her pencil and went back to her drawing. But the fact that she had even spoken about it felt like progress. Maybe things would be okay, after all. Saturday came, and I took Dylan to his soccer tryout. The field was packed with kids and parents, all watching as the coach barked orders. Dylan looked nervous but determined, his jaw set as he jogged out onto the field. I stayed on the sidelines, not wanting to add any pressure, but I couldn't help feeling a surge of pride as I watched him play. He was fast-focused, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the old Dylan, the kid who loved soccer more than anything. When the tryout ended, he came jogging over to me, sweat dripping down his face, but a huge grin on his lips. "I made it, Dad. I'm in." I couldn't help but grin back. "That's amazing, Dylan. I'm proud of you." He shrugged like it was no big deal, but I could see how much it meant to him. Maybe this was the fresh start he needed. Later that night, I sat on the back porch again, the cool Portland air brushing against my skin. The house was quiet, Emma was already in bed, and Dylan was still riding the high of his tryout, probably texting his friends. I stared out into the yard, thinking about what Sarah had said. What was my next step? My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out expecting a text from Megan or Dylan, but it was from Alyssa. "We need to talk." I stared at the message, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't floating anymore. I had a direction, a future I could finally see. I texted back, my fingers moving quickly over the screen. There's nothing left to talk about. We're done. The moment I hit send, it felt like a weight lifted off my chest. I wasn't sure why I hadn't done it sooner. Maybe some part of me had still been clinging to the idea that Alyssa and I could fix things. But now, staring at that simple text, I realized it was over. Really over. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Dylan was deep into soccer practice, and Emma had started hanging out with Megan more, helping her with her garden. She still didn't talk much, but there was something peaceful about the way she moved through the world. It felt like things were starting to settle, even if just a little. But then came Sarah. It wasn't anything dramatic. No grand declaration, no sudden confession. It was just natural. We met up for coffee again, like we'd been doing for weeks, but this time, the air felt different. Lighter. More open. You seem happier, she said, watching me carefully over the rim of her cup. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. Things are falling into place, I guess. Sarah smiled, that same warm smile I'd fallen for all those years ago. So, are you ready to talk about what's next? I set my cup down, my mind racing. She wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding anything from me. But the truth was, I wanted to talk about what was next. For the first time in months, I actually felt like I had a future, and she was a big part of that. I don't know what the future holds, I said, meeting her eyes. But I know I want you in it. It was the first time I'd said anything close to that, and I wasn't sure how she'd respond. But instead of looking surprised, she just nodded, like she'd known all along. Then let's see where this goes. We didn't label it. There was no need. We spent more time together, blending our lives bit by bit. She came over for dinner a few times, and Megan, ever the watchful older sister, approved. The kids were cautious at first, especially Dylan. But Emma seemed to like having Sarah around. Maybe it was the fact that Sarah gave her space, never asking too many questions, just offering a quiet, steady presence. A few weeks later, Alyssa called. I almost didn't pick up, but something told me it was time to finally hear her out. What do you want, Alyssa? I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. I'm not calling to fight, she said quickly, her voice softer than I'd expected. I want to apologize. I messed up, Ryan. I know that now. There was a long pause as I waited for her to continue. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe excuses, maybe more blame. But instead, she just sighed. I didn't realize how much I was losing until it was already gone. You, the kids, everything. Nathan's gone, by the way. It was never what I thought it was. I wasn't surprised, but I didn't say anything. I'm filing for divorce, she said, her voice cracking slightly. I'm not asking for anything. I just want it to be over, clean, for both of us. The relief I felt was immediate, but I kept it in check. All right, I said. Let's get it done. Thank you, she whispered, and for a moment, I could hear the Alyssa I used to know, the one I fell in love with before everything went wrong. Can I see the kids? I hesitated. This was the part one wasn't sure about. I'll talk to them, I said carefully. If they want to see you, we'll make it happen. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew it had to be up to Dylan and Emma. They were old enough to make their own choices, and I wasn't going to force them into anything they didn't want. When I told them about Alyssa's request, Dylan barely reacted. He just shrugged. She can come if she wants. But I'm not talking to her unless I feel like it. Emma, on the other hand, took longer to process it. She sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. Finally, she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Okay, she can come. It wasn't exactly an enthusiastic response, but it was something. So, I called Alyssa back and told her she could visit next weekend. I wasn't sure how it would go, but at least we were taking steps. For the kids, if nothing else. The weekend came quickly. Alyssa arrived on Saturday afternoon, looking smaller somehow, more fragile than I remembered. She stood at the front door, her eyes scanning the house as if it had changed in the few weeks since she'd last been here. I let her in without much fanfare, just stepping aside as Dylan and Emma came downstairs. The reunion was quiet, awkward. Alyssa smiled tentatively at them, but Dylan didn't return it. Emma stood behind him, watching everything like she was waiting for something to break. "Hey," Alyssa said softly, stepping forward. "I missed you guys." Dylan folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "You missed us?" Alyssa winced but didn't flinch. "Yeah, I did." Silence stretched between them, and for a moment I wasn't sure if this was a mistake. But then Emma stepped out from behind Dylan, her small voice breaking the tension. "Can we sit outside?" Alyssa blinked, then nodded quickly. Of course. They headed to the backyard, and I stayed inside, giving them space. From the window, I watched as they sat together on the porch, talking softly. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Later that night, after Alyssa left, Emma came up to me. "It's going to take time," she said quietly, her eyes wide and serious. "But I think we'll be okay." I nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "Yeah, kiddo, I think we will." And for the first time in a long time I believed it. The weeks that followed were strangely calm. Alyssa had made her visit, and while the kids were still guarded around her, the ice had started to thaw. I didn't push them to see her again right away, and Alyssa, to her credit, didn't push either. It was like we had all silently agreed to let things progress at their own pace, without forcing anything. Meanwhile, Sarah and I were slowly finding a rhythm. We hadn't officially put a label on what we were, but it was clear to both of us that this was more than just old friends reconnecting. She came over more often now, sometimes just to have dinner, other times to help Emma with her art or to chat with Megan when she visited. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah and I sat out on the back porch, the sky dimming to twilight. We didn't say much at first, just enjoying the quiet together, sipping our drinks. But after a while, she turned to me, her expression serious. "Ryan, I've been thinking," she said, her voice low. I raised an eyebrow, trying to keep things light. "That sounds dangerous." She smiled, but it was a soft, hesitant one. "No, really. I've been thinking about us." The air between us shifted, and I knew this was the conversation I had been waiting for. She wasn't one for playing games, and neither was I. It was time to lay it all out. "What about us?" I asked, setting my drink down and turning to face her fully. She paused for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "I don't want to rush you. I know things are still fresh with the divorce, and the kids are going through a lot. But I need to know if we, are something real to you." I could hear the vulnerability in her voice, and it struck me hard. Sarah was the kind of person who didn't put her heart on the line lightly. And here she was, offering me something I wasn't sure I deserved. "It is real," I said, my voice steady. "I don't know where it's going, but I know that being with you feels right. I haven't felt this way in a long time." Her shoulders relaxed a little, and she let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I feel the same. I just didn't want to make assumptions." I reached out, taking her hand. "You're not. But you're right. I do have a lot going on with the kids, with everything. I'm still trying to figure out how to be their dad without everything falling apart. But I want you to be a part of that, if you're okay with taking it slow." Sarah nodded, her smile returning, this time warmer, more genuine. "I'm okay with slow, as long as we're on the same page." We sat in comfortable silence after that, the tension that had been building between us easing. The future wasn't crystal clear, but for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was living, and that made all the difference. A few days later, Dylan had his first soccer game with the new team. It was a chilly Saturday morning, and the field was packed with parents, siblings, and kids warming up. Dylan had been buzzing with excitement all week, and even though he didn't say it, I knew he was counting on me to be there for him. As the game started, I stood on the sidelines, feeling a strange mix of nerves and pride. It had been a long time since I'd seen Dylan so focused, so driven. He was a completely different kid out there, determined, fearless. I couldn't help but smile as he darted across the field, playing with more energy than I'd seen in him in months. Next to me, Sarah showed up halfway through, slipping in beside me with a cup of coffee in hand. "Sorry I'm late," she said, smiling. "Traffic." I shook my head. "No worries. You're just in time." She watched Dylan for a moment, her eyes following his every move. "He's good. Really good." "Yeah," I said, feeling that swell of pride again. "He is." The game was intense, both teams battling hard. But in the end, Dylan's team pulled off a win. When the final whistle blew, I saw him glance over at me, a grin on his face, and I knew that look. He was waiting for my approval, my acknowledgement that he'd done well. I gave him a thumbs up, and he nodded, still grinning as he jogged over to his teammates. After the game, we all gathered near the field, the boys on the team laughing and high-fiving each other. Dylan came over, wiping sweat from his forehead, his face flushed but happy. "Great game," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Thanks, Dad," he said, a little out of breath. "Did you see that last play?" "I saw it." "You nailed it." Dylan beamed, then turned to Sarah, who had been standing quietly beside us. "Hey, Sarah," he said a little more shyly. "Hey," she replied with a smile. "You were amazing out there. I can't believe how fast you are." Dylan blushed slightly at the compliment, but tried to play it cool. "Yeah, well, I've been working on that." It was a small moment, but it felt big. Sarah wasn't just someone I cared about. She was becoming part of our lives. Slowly, carefully, but she was there. And the kids were starting to accept that. The divorce papers arrived the following week. Alyssa hadn't fought anything, just like she'd promised. It was clean, simple, no drawn-out battles, no ugly confrontations. Just a quiet end to something that had already been over for a long time. I signed them without hesitation, dropping the envelope off at the post office the same day. It felt surreal, like I should have been more emotional, but all I felt was relief. The chapter was closing, and I was finally free to move forward. That evening, as I sat on the porch with Sarah again, I told her about the papers. She listened, nodding as I explained the details, but when I finished, she didn't say anything right away. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes soft. "How do you feel about it?" "Honestly, relieved," I said, letting out a long breath. "I thought I'd feel, I don't know, something bigger. But all I feel is relief." She smiled, squeezing my hand. "That's a good sign. It means you're ready to move on." And I was. For the first time in years, I was truly ready to move on. As the weeks turned into months, things began to settle into a new normal. Dylan thrived on his soccer team, and Emma slowly opened up more, her artwork blossoming into something incredible. Sarah became a constant presence, not just for me, but for the kids as well. She wasn't trying to replace anyone. She was just there, steady and supportive. Life was far from perfect, but it was ours. We had faced the storm, weathered the worst of it, and now we were standing on the other side, stronger for it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about what was coming next.